Good morning. Good morning. My name is Roy Budd. I'm the director for the Center for Business and Community Services at Thomas Nelson Community College, and we'd like to welcome you to our annual Articulation Conference. I should say our conference is generating into a regional educational forum, and so it's our pleasure certainly to host you and to have you here today with us. We hope that you enjoy our presentations. We've got some excellent speakers that will be talking with you today, and we've got some excellent breakout facilitators that will be highlighting some very dynamic and interesting programs taking place within our school systems and colleges here on the Virginia Peninsula. I'd like to just bring to your attention some of the industry displays that are outside in the lobby area. These are industry partners with Thomas Nelson Community Colleges and the local school systems with a project that we've entitled Atoms. We'd like for you to be sure to take a look at those displays and talk with those industry reps that are here highlighting that particular partnership and that particular program. You'll find that we have registration packets. If you don't have a packet, be sure to check at the registration table to get one. And the packets will highlight the various programs that we've got planned for you today, as well as some other materials that are relating to partnership arrangements that Thomas Nelson Community College has with the local school systems and local business and industry. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the president of Thomas Nelson Community College, Dr. Robert Templin.
Welcome. This has become an annual event for us, and I'm glad to see that so many of you have returned again from last year. Last year marked a historic beginning. Not for us so much, because the theme of partnership between business, education, and local government is not a new theme here on the Virginia Peninsula. Under the leadership of the Virginia Peninsula Chamber of Commerce, and with a variety of other organizations pitching in, we've developed a reputation here for creating a unified approach to providing a complete and continuing education for our youngsters and for adults here in the region. But last year was historic because a new administration had just been inaugurated, and for the first time, two cabinet members met together, one from the business community in economic development, the other from the education community, the Secretary of Education, met at a conference here almost 1 year ago and gave attention to some of the work that we were doing here and developed an idea that there was a partnership for excellence that could be a key ingredient to strengthening Virginia education. As a consequence of that realization, Governor Wilder last August appointed a Governor's Advisory Committee on Virginia Workforce 2000. Some of those people that were among the 21 Virginians that were appointed to that advisory committee included Mr. Ed Campbell, Newport News Shipbuilding, Delegate Shirley Cooper, delegate from the Yorktown area, Senator Bobby Scott. It included myself and an individual who resides in Williamsburg, who is president of the Virginia Chamber of Commerce, Norm Beatty. In addition to that, there were a number of other individuals made primarily drawn from the Virginia corporate world, leaders of Virginia business, including the president of Virginia Power, the chairman and chief executive officer of the James River Corporation, and chairman of the board of Circuit City. These individuals held meetings across the state, talking with teachers, business leaders, and other interested individuals who are concerned about the future of public education in Virginia. After those 4 public hearings were held, and one was held here on the peninsula, viewing model programs for partnership of excellence. By the way, a number of those were featured in the final report were right here on the Virginia Peninsula. Then the task force, the Governor's Committee met and debated the future of Virginia's education. They made a number of startling findings, not the least of which is that Virginia workers, while they're increasing their productivity year by year, are slipping in their productivity when it's compared to an international standard. We found that while Virginia worker productivity over the past 15 years has increased by 120%, Canadian workers have increased their productivity by 215%. French workers have increased their productivity by over 400%. West German workers have increased their productivity by over 500%, and the Japanese, in that same period of time, increased worker productivity by 1,624%. America's workers are slipping in their competitive edge when benchmarked against world-class standards. And as we looked at the future of the American worker to be competitive in a growing information age, a global economy, it was clear that our future rests in the hands of our schools. And as we looked at Virginia's students, as they compared with students throughout the South, we found out that Virginia students do very well and are growing stronger, and nationally are above average. But our focal point rested on the conclusion that for our students, tomorrow's workers, to be significantly competitive, their skills will have to be benchmarked not against the South, not benchmarked against national standards, but benchmarked against the highest in the world. And with that goal in mind, then we released a report to Governor Wilder in March, and I believe that all of you have a copy of the report in your packet, called Partnerships for Excellence, the Virginia Plan for Strengthening the Commonwealth's 21st Century Workforce. I think it presents the challenge that is before not only education, but is before Virginia business. It offers a blueprint for action that can be achieved only through determined, collaborative partnerships between Virginia schools at all levels, preschool through higher education, and Virginia business. It is a recognition that the task and the challenge of our schools cannot be handled by our schools alone, but only through concerted effort with partnerships from business and industry and local government can we meet the test that's before us. As a result, 1 year later, we meet together to examine this report and to discuss its implications. For as we know already, simply the partnership effort alone won't be sufficient to meet the task ahead. It will require fundamentally reorganizing some of the ways that we think about the work that we do. And here today to discuss that with us will be two individuals who were leaders on the Governor's Advisory Committee. First, this morning you'll hear from our State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Joseph Spagnola. And then at lunch today, you will hear from the Chairman of the Board of Circuit Cities to provide a business perspective with what's required for the challenges of the 21st century. So first, I would like to turn to Dr. Spagnola. Dr. Spagnola is Virginia's Superintendent of Public Instruction. This is a post that he has held since last July. His biographical sketch is contained in your agenda, in the program that you have in your packet. What I'd like to do, in addition to providing that introduction, is to tell you a little bit more. Dr. Spagnola was clearly one of the most visionary and articulate of the members of the Governor's Task Force, with a clear practical understanding of the requirements of day-to-day school operations and leadership, having been superintendent of schools in Lynchburg. He turns his attention to the future, to an unknown future, and the incredible challenge of preparing today's youth for that unknown future. He was willing to enter into an open and candid conversation, a challenging conversation with Virginia's business leaders, listening, but also responding to the basic purposes and functions of public education in Virginia, not only for an educated workforce, but for an educated citizenship upon which our democracy rests. As a consequence, Dr. Spagnola clearly has emerged as, not only by position, one of the leading educators in Virginia, but by his thought. And we've invited him here today to talk about not the recommendations that are in the task force report that you can read, but how it is that we begin the fundamental process of restructuring our curriculum so that our students are able to face the challenges of the 21st century. I give you Dr. Joseph Spagnola.
Good morning. I want to thank Bob for that very nice introduction. It is a real pleasure and a privilege to be here with you today, to be among so many outstanding educators and business people. Before I begin, I'd like to recognize some individuals in this audience who are very important to the process of education in this Commonwealth. Those individuals are the school superintendents in this area. And I don't want to embarrass them, but I would just like to take a minute and introduce them very briefly and ask them to stand, because these people are the ones that make it go, that make it happen. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to introduce Don Musselman from Hampton, Judy Ball from York County, Don Bruno from Newport News, back, and Ray Vernal from Poquoson. I don't think I missed anybody, but I'd like to give them a round of applause for everything that they do. I would also like to take a moment to pay tribute to a very special person in my mind. I got to know this person serving on this advisory committee, and during the course of the weeks and months that we worked together, he impressed me with his intellect, with his drive, and with his commitment. I know he's impressed you the same way. Bob Templin had a lot to do with putting together the Workforce 2000 report. He headed the writing committee, and he committed the resources of Thomas Nelson to making this the report that it is today. So I'd like to take a couple of minutes and just recognize Bob for his efforts, not only those efforts, but these efforts here today for putting this together. Bob, enjoy. Bob asked me to come today and talk with you about some of my ideas concerning the restructuring of public education and how they relate or how they interface to the Workforce 2000 report. And I'd very much like to do that. I think it's an opportunity for us to discuss where we go from here. The report itself, in my opinion, is a major impetus or a major catalyst for us to improve education in this Commonwealth. It's a quality piece of work. It represents bringing together education and business in a common goal. And I think it should be utilized as the catalyst that it is. Public education draws a lot of attention, and well it should. 1 out of every 4 people in this country today is involved in this enterprise. We spend $200 billion per year on elementary and secondary schooling. In Virginia, we spend $4 billion per year on education. Despite this level of commitment, we have problems. The dropout rate is too high, poor performance of our graduates, a lack of international competitiveness. there have been 300 studies addressing these deficiencies. All purport to contain the solutions. But I want to tell you today, there are no easy answers. There are no panaceas. There are no quick fixes. A sage once quipped, "The freeway of American education is cluttered with the wrecks of famous bandwagons." We have a propensity in this business to jump on things and ride them for a while and then jump off and jump on something else. That is a trend, ladies and gentlemen, that in my view we must change and reverse. As you know, we face many complex problems in education today. Stark reality impinges on our efforts to educate the children of this Commonwealth and this nation. For example, every 8 seconds, an American child drops out of school. Every 47 seconds, an American child is abused or neglected. Every 67 seconds, a teenager has a baby in this country. Every 7 minutes, an American child is arrested for some drug offense. Every 30 minutes in America, a child is arrested for drunk driving. Every 36 minutes, a child is killed or injured by a gun. And most startling to me, every 53 minutes in America, a child dies as a direct result of poverty. Now that's not Kuwait or Venezuela or Puerto Rico. That's America. Every 53 minutes, a child dies as a result of poverty. In addition to these grim realities, the downturn in the economy has obviously made our job more difficult. Not since the Depression years has state aid to local schools been reduced. It's a first in this Commonwealth in the last 50 years. But these are exciting times in Virginia. When I took this job 8 months ago, I had a full head of hair. And I was 6'4" tall. And I looked 29, not 69. Against that backdrop, I'd like to tell you some of my ideas in terms of what I think we should do. We need to create a system of education that will support the development of a competent workforce in the future. And we must look analytically at our system of education for that to happen. I feel compelled to ask a simple question. What, if anything, is wrong with the public schools of our country? My response may be somewhat paradoxical. I believe, or in my opinion, nothing is wrong and everything is wrong. Let me explain. In the last 50 years, we've entered the atomic age, the space age, the computer age, the information age. Change has been so rapid that it's mind-boggling. But alas, since the early 1900s, our system of public schooling has changed little in fundamental structure and function. Schools are essentially the same today as they were in the last decade of the last century. And in my opinion, therein lies the problem. We cannot comfort ourselves by saying in the traditional sense, schools today are probably better than they ever have been before. We retain students longer. We do a better job at providing universal education than in previous generations. Unfortunately, in my opinion, our schools lack relevancy. We are failing to meet the needs of many students. 25% of the young people that start school never finish, whatever finishing means. Another 40% wander aimlessly through a watered-down curriculum. They're unprepared to deal with academic work, and they're unprepared to deal with life. We are trying to fix a 1990s problem with 1940s solution. We can no longer deal with a changing ecology or environment without changing ourselves. As we look to the millennium, to tinker with or somehow adjust that which we are now doing simply will be insufficient. In other words, we need to reinvent the system of schooling in this country. We need to build a more relevant mousetrap. To that end, another question. Where do we go from here? I remember as a young man, John Kennedy saying, "I believe this nation should commit itself to the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon." Our goal, as stated in the Partnership for Excellence report, is to create a world-class system of education to meet the needs of children and youth by the end of this decade. It is certainly within the realm of possibility to do that with education in this Commonwealth, despite our problems. We cannot use the financial difficulties which we face as an excuse to do nothing. We must view it as an opportunity and as a challenge to do something. We must put education figuratively on the moon. The challenge before us is the same challenge that this nation faced in the early 60s. We have to have a national purpose. We have to have a state commitment. Accomplishing this goal requires creative, imaginative, but pragmatic approaches. What I'm about to propose to you today is not proposed in the sense of being a solution to the problem. I do not suggest to you that this is the only answer. I don't come to you with a bag of tricks that you could implement immediately and solve all the difficulties which you face. I am coming to you with some ideas that I hope will generate some debate and stir some interest. Please do not interpret these as a canned solution to the problems we face. I do not intend it that way, and please don't take it that way. What I want to do, if I do nothing else, is to have you leave this room today thinking about alternative ways to approach the problems we face, and to incorporate into that thinking the needs that are outlined in the Workforce 2000 report. Because after all, that's what all of this is all about. It's about the children we're serving today and the needs that they have in order to survive tomorrow. In my opinion, we must begin this process with an understanding of the nature of learning. That is fundamental to everything that we do, and literally every decision we make, and every course correction we take, and every change in programming that takes place must emanate from that. And I will tell you that has not been the case in the past. Schools are not designed for children. They're not even run for children. Schools are designed and run for adults. And if you doubt that, all you have to do is to go into one day and walk around a little bit and ask yourself a simple question. If I were 9 years old, how would this place seem to me? I think the answers you get would be hostile, uninviting, and not a very pleasant experience. We must understand how children learn at all developmental stages, and we must begin to restructure our thinking so that we can make the kind of changes that are in concert with their needs and not with ours. We must develop a common set of experiences that ensure all children have at least an opportunity to learn. As Robert Hudgens once said long ago, the education for the best is the best education for all. I'm amused sometime when we all do it. I did it for 17 years, and I would probably do it for more years if I remained where I was. and I'm sure it occurs in school systems here. We drive the bus up to the front of the building. We take out of the building all of the youngsters in the so-called gifted or advanced classes, and we take them to Williamsburg, or we take them to Washington, or we take them some other place. It's an interesting phenomenon because most of those children have probably been to those places, and the ones who really need to go are the ones that we leave in the school. Why not drive the school bus up to the front door and take the children who never had those experiences to Williamsburg and to Washington and all of those places where they can develop a context within which to learn? You see, as you know, and you know better than I, that children learn in a context. We all do. It's literally impossible to pluck some fact out of the air and learn it. It's got to occur within a context. We've got to build learning on learning. We succeed in widening the gap between those who can and cannot do by the very practices we engage in. We can no longer afford to have a disparate circumstance which exists in our Commonwealth today. For example, in one school system in this state, 49% of the students take advanced placement courses. In two school systems in this state, they don't even offer advanced placement courses. By accident of birth, you have the opportunity to participate or not participate. There is a crying need, in my opinion, for a system of public schools that advocates the same objectives for all without exception, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of where one happens to live or have been born. There is no way that we can meet the objectives set forth in the Governor's Advisory Committee report without a system of public schooling that will support the universal education of all students at a high level that is world-class in design. You can take the objectives of economic development. You can take the report that's been produced, and it's all for naught unless we can develop a system in which we're virtually reaching all of the students at a high level. The fragmentation of the curriculum, an uneven quality of courses that exists in schools today, not only bankrupts educational experiences generally, but makes disparity worse specifically. A common core of learning must be balanced with the needs of individual students, which leads one to the conclusion, or at least it leads me to the conclusion, that schools need to be structured differently than at the present time. Considering structure or organization, it would seem appropriate that the process of schooling begin at an earlier age. Researchers have demonstrated that much of what young people learn, they learn before the age of 5 or 6. I am not a learning theorist, but based on my perusal of the literature, as much as 70 or 80% of what we accumulate as human beings takes place before we ever come to school in this organization. Attitudes are formed, value systems are developed, and yet it all occurs before we even see them. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what that tells us. What it tells me is that we've got to start sooner. That's not profound, it's not innovative, it's not new. People have been talking about this for 20 or 25 years. Yet we have failed to recognize that at least early on in an education, it makes a big difference. Now, obviously, there's a downside. The research also tells us by the time the child's in school for 2 or 3 years, possibly by the time they reach the 3rd or 4th grade, the impact of that early intervention begins to diminish. But that's not a problem, that's a challenge. And the challenge is, how do we prevent that from happening? How do we build on what we've been able to accomplish and not lose it? The most critical portion of a child's education, therefore, are the early years. In my scheme of things, and my scheme is no better than your scheme, but I want to put the thoughts out there, as I said, and get you to think about them, create some debate. I'll probably say some things this morning that you do not agree with, and that's okay. I don't expect you to agree with everything I say, just most of it. Lower schools, as I refer to them, of the future, must incorporate programs that are developmental in nature. They must include parental and/or mentor involvement. They must include extended daycare opportunities to take into account learning experiences outside of formal schooling. You know, we talk about education as if we have a corner on the market. Education is a lifelong process. I prefer to refer to what we do as schooling. Because if education stops when the child or the young adult leaves the school for the last time, we're in a world of trouble. The best thing we can do is create an environment where people have an appetite for learning for as long as they live. Lower schools must include summer activities, so there's a building upon learning rather than regression during summer months. Schools need not be mammoth institutions, rather a sense of smallness, either physically or at least given the appearance of being small, must be developed. You know, we went through this period of time where we thought bigger was better. 300, well, 500's got to be better than 300, so let's build 500 pupil schools. 700 is bound to be better than 500, so let's build 700 pupil schools. We've got elementary schools in this state that are well over 1,000 students. In my opinion, that is too large. It's too impersonal. And they're not built for children. They're built for adults. Grade structure constraints should be abandoned. Grades, in my opinion, should disappear from that which we do. And schools must become failure-proof. I made these comments last night before a group of about 800 in Richmond at a Scottish Rite Affair, and a man came up to me afterwards and said, "You know, you must be the craziest human being on this earth. What are you talking about, no grades?" He says, "If I have somebody working on my chest in open heart surgery, apparently related to open heart surgery, so I gather he just had that experience a little while back." So I said, "Well, I probably agree with you as far as a heart surgeon's concerned, but I don't think there are many 8-year-old heart surgeons. We're talking about children, and we're talking about creating a mindset that builds their self-esteem by making them successful rather than making them failures." I read an article in a magazine called Crisis not too long ago where they talked about this matter of developing self-esteem and what was the best approach to that. And of course, there's a lot of self-esteem programs. But the conclusion of this article was the best way to build self-esteem is to create academic success, to allow people to enjoy succeeding rather than failing. And that is so true. If you just look at it intuitively, people feel better about themselves when they do well rather than when they don't do well. Expectations that teachers have is a critical issue in the matter of success or failure. You know, there was a study done recently where the researcher took a group of average children, or maybe a little bit below average children, and told the teacher that these are exceptional young people. You know what? They were exceptional. And the converse is also true. If you expect people to fail, if you expect them not to do well, they won't. Remedial programs are marginal at best. Remember, prevention's a lot easier than cure. As David Kern says, we need to do it right the first time. We can't afford to have 25% of the young people in this country and in this state leave school before they finish. Another 35 or 40% go through the process but not acquire anything in terms of academic or marketable skills. 35 to 40% of what we do, we can classify as success stories. Now, if I'm playing baseball, hitting 350 makes me a multimillionaire. But hitting 350 in this business is not near good enough. What it makes us in another generation is a second or third-rate economic entity in this global economy. Our emphasis in terms of committing resources must be at the lower school level in the future. We cannot afford to work on salvage projects which are destined to be failures. As people move out of that first level, which I would roughly categorize from ages 4 to 7 years, a second level would be for students in the 8 to 12 age span, which consists of common experiences that focus on the attainment of cognitive skills, group work, exploration, and investigation. These schools should provide support and care in coping during a period of instability and uncertainty as young people traverse the gap between childhood and adulthood. In partnership with community organizations, these middle-level schools of the future must offer multiple methods for fostering learning of early adolescence. One of the cruelest hoaxes that we engage in schools today is packaging together a group of early and pre-adolescent students and committing them to a life of boxes and structure and inactivity and listening to other people talk when they're not made that way. They don't learn that way. We've got to open our minds and do something different. A third level should be for those young people from 13 to 16 years. This level of education should be characterized by a greater level of abstraction and understanding of complex concepts. Young people at this age must learn to deal with their environment, they must learn to make good decisions, and they must learn to act in a rational way. They must be encouraged to participate in service projects that enhance citizenship. They've got to get out of a mindset which deals with me first. They've got to realize there's a big world out there, and we've got to figure out somehow to live with people who are different than we are. We've got to figure out somehow to understand different cultures and different value systems and to accept them for what they are. They must be challenged vigorously in an academic environment and not be allowed to elect watered-down courses that serve no useful purpose. Rand did a recent study on algebra, and they found throughout this country that courses labeled algebra are not all algebra. They ranged from general mathematics to pre-algebra to algebra. A rose is not a rose is not a rose. And unfortunately what happens is we dumb this curriculum down so that those who we perceive can't do won't do. We allow young people to go through school taking meaningless courses that are unrelated to one another, and then we wonder why they're unemployable. We wonder why business people come back to us and say, these people can't read, they can't write, they can't think, they can't do anything. How do they have this diploma? They have the diploma because we created a system that doesn't expect or demand anything. Now, not all of our students are going to be brain surgeons. They're not all going to be doctors and lawyers and Indian chiefs. In some cases, it might take more than 1 year to learn algebra. But if algebra is important for one person, it's got to have some relevancy for everybody. If Shakespeare is important for one student, why isn't it important for others? Now, maybe it might be King Lear or Hamlet in one case and the Merchant of Venice in another. But if it's important for some, it's important for all. Compulsory schooling, in my opinion, and this is only my opinion, I would probably be shouted down by some that Bob and I both know for saying this, but compulsory attendance should conclude at age 16. I see no purpose in going beyond that point. If you understand schooling at all, it becomes a matter of practicality. You know that students can take senior English and government, assuming they've even made a slight effort, and be finished after the junior year. You know that the 8th grade traditionally has been nothing but a review of what's happened in the past, It's been that way since 1950 when it started, or 50. You know that many young people in the last 2 years of school are simply bored to death. Most of them don't want to be there. The ones who have the social skills and the ability to communicate outfox you. They stay there. The attitude is, if you don't bother me, I'm not going to bother you. The ones who are not so inclined raise hell and give you a fit. There's no point in keeping them beyond 16. I spoke to a group not too long ago who also said that is absolute heresy. A 16-year-old cannot make a decision like I'm about to outline for you. Baloney. 16-year-olds make decisions all the time. They make decisions to go to the movies. They make decisions to drink beer. They make decisions as serious as becoming pregnant or helping somebody else become pregnant. They make all kinds of decisions. So why not a decision that leads one to begin to plan for the next 50 or 60 or 70 years of life? The compulsory portion of this schooling, which I would envision from ages 4 to 16, should conclude with the comprehensive assessment of progress. The comprehensive assessment of project progress referred to in the Workforce 2000 study is called the Virginia Assessment of Critical Knowledge and Skills. This assessment instrument obviously should be based on a great deal more than norm reference standardized tests. Norm reference standardized tests, again in my opinion, are about the worst thing that's happened to public schooling since their inception. The assessment should be an examination rather than a test. America's children are the most tested and least examined in this world. The examination should consist of criteria and reference indicators that are based on specific objectives and goals. They should include portfolios of student work throughout their school careers. And they should include some indication, possibly through a project process or an end-point collaborative effort, that would demonstrate their ability to work in concert with others. You see, it's not only going to be important in the future to be able to do things on your own, it's going to be important to do things in collaboration with other people. And that's something that we haven't emphasized in school. Predicated upon the outcome of the Virginia Assessment of Knowledge and Skills, as well as a student aptitude and interest, one of 4 options would then be available to young people. These options would be an intense college or university preparation characterized by advanced placement in college-level courses. At age 16, you go through the Virginia Assessment of Knowledge and Skills. If your interest lies in an academic area, you start. You start those academic pursuits that are going to lead to a baccalaureate degree. It may take you 4 years, it may take you 5 years, it may take you 6 years, it may take you 10 years, but you start. The second option would be a realistic and meaningful technical education program which would involve a serious partnership with the community college system in this particular state. We have 23 outstanding institutions. Thomas Nelson obviously is at the head of that list, and I don't mean that because Bob's sitting here. I really believe that. It's an outstanding institution. They have so much to offer people. We have got to give up and cease and desist from this turf battle, and I don't mince words, that's what it's been, about who's going to do what, and face realistically, how do we serve the public interest? In my view, I would much rather say to a young person, you're not going to vocational education. You're not going somewhere where we're going to store you for a while. You're going to college. And the expectations we have of you are that you're going to behave accordingly and that you're going to be expected to perform at a college level dealing with a technical subject. The third element and this is one, frankly, that troubled me greatly as we went through the Workforce 2000 project, is an American-styled youth apprenticeship program with the capabilities of allowing young people to work in a number of apprenticeship trades to learn how to perform a specific set of skills. Virtually every one of our economic competitors have apprenticeship programs for youth. Only the United States has nothing. The obvious advantage of apprenticeship programs is that a young person would spend his or her time in the company of adults rather than the company of children. We are the only nation that does not have a youth apprenticeship program. I read a recent publication by a fellow named Stephen Hamilton. As I said, just as an aside, when we discussed this point, it troubled a lot of us in terms of why is it that we can't get young people into apprenticeable trades. And based on the reading I've done since then, I've become convinced that that's a possibility if the business community will really join with us, big and small. I'm not just talking about Newport News, shipbuilding and dry dock. I'm talking about small businesses, electricians, plumbers, will join with us in a partnership, if you will, to make that happen. A fourth option would not necessarily require the successful completion of the Virginia Assessment of Knowledge and Skills examination, but would be created for those youngsters who possibly did not do that. They would be youth centers. Within the youth centers, individuals would have the opportunity to earn a wage while continuing to secure the necessary skills to successfully complete the Virginia Assessment of Critical Skills and Knowledge. It is extremely important to emphasize that there must be easy access among these alternatives. Now that's easy to say and difficult to do, but that's a critical piece that needs to occur. Where does that leave us? The results of this structural arrangement would be 12 years of schooling, similar to that which exists at this point in time, divided roughly into three equal elements. The key is the structure would be based on how children learn, rather than administrative convenience. We would do away with existing grade structures. We would organize based more on chronological age, which more closely align learning characteristics. In addition to the changes noted with respect to grade structure, the school day must be restructured to provide an opportunity for integration of coursework so that the approach to instruction is thematic rather than segmented and broken up into fragmented, unrelated parts. It is a travesty that students go through schooling experience in a series of unrelated programs that are meaningless, absolutely meaningless in a broad context. If you will take the secondary day, for example, typically the day is broken down into 6 or 7 pieces. Those 6 or 7 pieces are about 55 minutes long. You run them through English, social studies, mathematics, science, physical education, and something else like music or art. It reminds me of being in New York about 3 months ago, and I had to go from 82nd Street to 123rd Street, and I stopped this cab, and that was the first mistake. Got into the back of the cab, and I swear this guy's objective was to go at least 60 miles an hour by the time he hit the three-quarter point in the block. And then he would jump on the brake with both feet and come to a screeching halt. You did this for about 20 or 30 blocks, and mal de mer started to set in, back and forth, sick to your stomach by the time you get out. And I thought at that time, what a horrible experience. And then I thought about what we do to kids. We start them off at 8 o'clock in the morning or 8:15 or 7:30, whatever it is, and we run them through 55 minutes as hard as we can go, and we slam on the brakes. And then we shift gears and we put them through something else for 55 minutes. And we do this all day long. And then we look at the issue horizontally rather than vertically, and we start with that 300-page physics book in September, and we say, by glory, we're going to finish 300 pages of physics by June, come hell or high water, and we do it. And then we walk around with this puzzled look on our face and say, how come nobody knows any physics? Well, the answer is patently obvious. We haven't taught them any physics. We spend 85 to 90% of our time talking to people, expecting them to absorb what we know, and not have an opportunity to engage in a learning activity on their own. Schooling basically consists of memorizing rote facts that yield very little understanding to the principles involved or appreciation of any problem-solving activities, or more important than problem-solving, even rudimentary training and asking the right questions. A premium is placed on regurgitation of information that may be only marginally related to one's ability to function in a larger society. Therefore, a thematic approach must be taken where we integrate science and mathematics, where we integrate language arts, literature with fine arts. We integrate social studies and cultural awareness in a form to create a depth of understanding and an application rather than a breadth of presentation of unrelated information. Now, factual information, of course, is essential. Individuals should be able to apply basic information, but it shouldn't be the essence of the process. It should be a supporting element, similar to the way structural steel is a supporting element of a building, but does not constitute the building itself. Programs should be organized vertically rather than horizontally, so students are presented information in large blocks of time. Well, I've gone on too long and told you about a lot of my ideas. Some of them may be good, probably a lot of them not so good. I hope that you'll take an opportunity to reflect on some of the things we've said and on the Workforce 2000 report. America, obviously, is at a crossroads. Economic travail, precipitated at least in part by a lack of intensity and imagination and purpose, has begun to erode our standard of living. The work ethic has been impaired. Instant and significant gratification is expected for even the most modest effort. Many years ago, a noted historian, Henry Steele Commager, pointed out that our schools reflect the society they serve. Many of the failures we ascribe to contemporary education, in fact, are failures of the society as a whole. He goes on to say, a society that is indifferent to its own heritage cannot expect schools to make good the indifference. In all of this, to reform our schools is to reform ourselves. Let me leave you with a story about a little boy who tried to trick a very wise woman. He went to the wise woman and said, "What do I have behind my back?" The wise woman said, "You have a bird behind your back." The boy responded, "Yes, but is the bird dead or alive?" If the wise woman said the bird was dead, the boy would let it go. If the wise woman said the bird was alive, the boy would squeeze the bird to death. The wise woman paused and looked down at him and said, "My answer is the future of that bird is in your hands. The future of education is in our hands. To reform it, as Dr. Commager eloquently pointed out, is first to reform ourselves." Thank you very much.
We have a very large audience in a very short period of time, but I did promise that we would take a few questions. Mr. Dolo?
Sunday night I had the opportunity to hear the governor of New York speak, and he said some wonderful things about education. But what bothers me is that the end message is when we cut budgets, education is the first thing we cut. Now, isn't there a mixed message in that? What do the students think? What do people who want the teachers think? If this is so important for America, why do we always cut it first?
I think that's a good observation. I was taken reading the Washington Post this weekend, there were 2 or 3 articles that sort of hit my mind. I always read the sports page first because I can't get hurt too bad on the sports page. And I noticed that Rocket Ismail signed a contract for $26.2 million to play football in Toronto or somewhere. Then I turned over the front page and I noticed that John Sununu had made 60 trips to go skiing at the expense of $500,000 or whatever. There's a third one that I forget. I think your point's a good one. The priorities of this society or this culture we live in, education's not very high. I don't have an answer to your question, but I will tell you this. I think that rather than approaching this issue from a monetary point of view first, because the public's tired of that, and no matter what we say and how much we complain about it, that's not going to change. I think what we need to do is approach this from the great idea perspective. Great ideas always prevail. Not necessarily right away, but they always prevail. And I think what we need to do as educators is assume the agenda for education in this country. We have been standing on the sidelines. We've left the playing field, and we've let everybody else occupy it. They've got the ball, and they've been running in 14 different directions with it. We have got to come up with the great ideas and go about this process in a very clear, very consistent way and saying these are the things that we believe we ought to create hypotheses about, and these are the things that we should test. And when we find out that they work, we have to go out there and sell them. And believe me, if you can sell this concept or these concepts or any concepts to the public, the money part will be easy. Right now, there's not a lot of confidence in what we're doing. There's just not. And a lot of it has to do with the rhetoric that has been floating around for a decade or more. You know, public schooling started to get a rap not last year or 10 years ago. The end of the Second World War is when it started. And it's been going on ever since, and it's been going downhill ever since. We've got to change the way people think about what we're doing, and we've got to invest on the power of ideas. If we approach this thing trying to go through the front door, saying we need 50 billion more, 100 billion more, they're going to slam the door in our face. And they've been doing it. They're going to continue to do it because they don't believe what they're getting for the money is worthwhile. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's the fact. That's just the way it is. Bob, you
talked about a great plan, but we've still got now a large number of those people who can't do the system and did not get anything out of it. They either dropped out of it or, as you said, it never took. Now, those people are being wasted in our society as it is right now. Is there any picture right now to do something about salvaging them? Because they are great people and they have the potential. But the fragmentation of any let's do it right the second time is really tough to do.
Yeah, again, another excellent point. We have at least 2 generations we need to be concerned about. The one we have in school now and the one that preceded it. My focal point, frankly, is the one that's in school now. Not that I don't think the other is important. I see the importance of the adult population, if you will, in terms of what influence they have on the population that we now have involved in schooling. And I don't mean to beg the question, because I think education for adults and literacy is important, very important. But we have such a full plate to deal with what we're confronted with presently that I think that should be somebody else's prime responsibility. We ought to be supportive. We ought to provide space. We ought to do whatever we can do to make sure that it happens. But we can't be all things to all people. I know that's not the response that folks want to hear, people want to hear. We can take that on and we can solve it. We can do a limited number of things well, and we should concentrate on those things and support the efforts of other people in terms of providing for the generations gone before us.
One of the things that you stressed in county school is how important it is through or between the various classes. And yet I think the state board needed to go, let's say, work citizens or work all college together. And isn't that inconsistent with what those 2 guys do?
Well, the State Board of Education is presently in the process of re-examining its goals, re-examining its direction, looking at where education ought to go for the next 10 years. We've talked a lot about the fact that there are no quick fixes. We're really not interested in coming forward with a grand plan that's going to be implemented in the next biennium. In toto, we're interested in developing a foundation and a framework and look at this as a decade-long project. People will become impatient with that because it's the American way that you want an instantaneous response to everything. You want to turn the TV on, you want to be instantly gratified. And unfortunately, that's not the way this process is going to work. The State Board of Education is moving in a direction, I think, that will be consistent with Workforce 2000, consistent with the Disparity Commission, and consistent with maybe not specifically what I said this morning, but the direction that we talked about this morning. Yes, sir. Sure. There's one in every crowd, right? I don't know that anybody will be able to measure my performance in and of itself, because I'm just part of a bigger project, I guess. I would hope that at the end of my term, which is January of 1994, be able to look back and say we now have a foundation in place to move forward from. I don't really expect this to be a tenure in which you see a lot of dramatic change, in which you see a lot of flash and pizzazz and whistles and bells. I really don't. My approach is not that. I'm not interested in creating a great deal of superficial change that may appear at first blush as being a move in the right direction. I'm more interested in creating a foundation that we can build on for the rest of this decade. And that may be awfully difficult to measure, but that's about the best answer I can give you.
Dr. Spagnola, on behalf of Thomas Nelson Community College and all of our partners that are here from business and industry and our schools, I want to thank you for being with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You thought he was provocative. Wait till Alan Wurtzel comes this afternoon. It makes him look like a calm speaker in comparison. Before we break into our 4 different breakout sessions, there are a few other people in the audience that I'd like to recognize. First, we have with us at least one, maybe more, members of our Board of Education that are here from our local boards. I know Dr. Price is here, and if there are other members of our boards of education, would they please stand? Dr. Price, thank you for being with us today. Thomas Nelson Community College continues its linkage with the public schools, and we're very proud to have 3 of our board members with us today, and as I call them, if they would please stand. Mr. Henry Godfrey, who is the principal of Ferguson High School, Elise Emanuel, who is a counselor at Lafayette High School, Elise, and Ruth Simmons, who's a counselor at Phoebus High School. Thank you for being with us. And 2 people who are critical, in fact, are leaders in the education community and in the business community simultaneously, people who facilitate the coming together of our schools, higher education, and our business community, are the 2 chief executive officers of our various chambers of commerce. First, Al Tompkins, chief executive officer of the Virginia Peninsula Chamber of Commerce, Al, and Robert Hirschberger, who's the chief executive officer of the Williamsburg Area Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for being with us. Our program now calls for you to choose one of 4 breakout sessions that help to bring the report to life and to action, to look at the implications of what we're talking about in the future for what we're doing now. We have 4 breakout sessions that will begin immediately as we adjourn, and we'll move till 10:45. Then with the brief break, and you switch and choose another of the 4 that you would like, we'll meet back together at 12 noon for our luncheon enclosure. Thank you very much for being with us. For those, hold on. For those of you that haven't finished your dessert, go right ahead and continue eating, but I know that many of you are on very tight schedules, so we're going to continue on with our program. But before we do, we've had one other member of the Governor's Advisory Committee join us for this portion of the conference, and I'd like to recognize Senator Bobby Scott. Bobby, if you'll stand. Well, I hope that you've had a productive meeting thus far. You heard some provocative remarks this morning from an educator's point of view. You've had a chance to look at a number of activities that are underway in our school divisions that are putting vision into practice, setting models for many of us to follow. And now this afternoon we're going to hear from a leading American business figure to place into context the challenges of education that we have before us. I'm very pleased and proud that today Mr. Alan Wurtzel is going to be our featured speaker. This afternoon we're going to view the context of our economy and education and the challenges that we face, looking at it from a business person's perspective. Mr. Wurtzel, as you'll note from your program, is presently chairman of the board of Circuit City Stores. Previously, he was the chief executive officer of Circuit City, and under his leadership, developed that organization into the largest and most profitable retailer of name brand appliances and consumer electronics in the United States. Alan knows the business environment very well and of the challenges that America's business and education face if we're going to be competitive in an increasingly global environment. More importantly, Alan not only knows what it is that America's businesses are up against, he's willing to share that knowledge and that insight with other parts of society that are essential to America maintaining its standard of living. He's the member of the National Commission on the Skills of the American Workforce. That commission, just about a year ago, Alan, released a report called America's Choice, High Skills or Low Wages, published by the National Center on Education and the Economy. That report is clearly becoming a national pace setter, a trend setter, a national agenda setter for America, and it was a report that the Governor's Advisory Committee studied very closely and depended upon in drawing its own recommendations. Alan was one of the most outspoken and visionary of the members of the Governor's Advisory Committee, as you're soon to find out. It's with a great deal of pleasure that I introduce to you Alan Wurtzel. Alan?
President Templin, Senator Scott, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm very honored and happy to be here and to talk to you about education and the economy from my limited perspective as a businessman and the wider perspective that I was privileged to have by serving on this national commission to which Bob referred on education and the economy, and to serve on the Virginia Advisory Commission. My only reservation is that I understand you've had an absolutely terrific presentation by Joe Spagnola this morning, and that he's a tough act to follow. But I'll do my best and try and talk about the importance of education and the things that you're doing here to the long-term future, as I see it, of the United States. Virginia has been a leader in American history, as we all know. And I believe that Virginia is beginning to lead again in this important area. The Governor's Commission's report, to which Bob referred, and the things I heard today, both from Bob Templin and sitting in some of the seminars, indicate to me that the winds of change are blowing very strong and very hard here in Tidewater. Thomas Nelson and Bob Templin are at the forefront of that leadership effort. As you know, we both served on this commission, and Bob was an intellectual force and also the principal mediator and facilitator. And he and his staff, particularly Mike Quanti and Mike Bruno, were very, very instrumental, not only in producing the information and shaping the materials and honing the arguments, but finally in bringing this thing together and getting it published and distributed. And all Virginians should be very grateful to them and to Thomas Nelson for their leadership effort in this program. But writing a report, difficult and strenuous it is relatively easy compared to making the recommendations in that report happen. And it's conferences like this and the efforts that Thomas Nelson is doing with the Adams and the Beams and the Summer Institutes and the mentoring, internship, and apprenticeship programs and the involvement in K through 12 that is exemplified by this conference and the people here and all of the things you're doing. It's that implementation and the drive to continue to implement the best recommendations of the Virginia Commission report and the National Commission report and the President's report that was recently issued is going to make Virginia a real leader in this country in educational reform and in creating the partnership between business and education that's going to put this nation back on the track of world leadership. Now, as Bob said, many of the ideas in Workforce 2000, in the Virginia report, were shaped by the national study called America's Choice, high skills or low wages. What I'd like to do for the next few minutes is take you through the highlights of that report and explain to you the context, the economic and business context in which our commission sees this problem. So if we could have the slides, that will help us or help me to explain what what we were talking about. Okay, thank you. Hey, pardon? What do I do with this? Oh, I see. Okay, thank you. The commission, I should tell you, consisted of 34 members. The commission consisted of 34 members. It was chaired by two former secretaries of labor, one Republican and one Democrat, Bill Brock and Ray Marshall. It included the CEOs of some of America's leading businesses, Kodak, Corning, Apple, Ford, Aetna, labor leaders from the UAW and the AFL-CIO and the American Federation of State Municipal Employees, two former governors, Governor Keene of New Jersey and Hunt of North Carolina, and educators from MIT, from a fellow named Gonzalez from Washington, representing the community college movement, teachers, the armed forces, educational programs, and a whole variety of people that are interested on a broad basis in seeing this country move forward. Unlike many other reports, the methodology imposed here was actually on-the-ground research of what it is that business and education is doing in creating jobs and creating high technology jobs and improving productivity in this country and in 6 other countries. And a number of the commissioners and a large number of the staff actually spent time, in the case of the staff, weeks and months, in Germany, Sweden, Ireland, Denmark, Japan, and Singapore. They interviewed hundreds of companies abroad and over 300 companies in the United States. So there was basic research here, not just a rehash of conventional wisdom, which is often found in commission reports of this kind. And the basic message, the basic things that we found are on the next few slides. Basically, the United States is facing what we call an economic cliff, and we're about to drop off that cliff. And if there's one single fact or statistic or piece of information that you carry away with you today, I would suggest that it's this first slide, is the most important to me and the most telling message or the most telling indicator of the problems that this country is facing. What this slide shows is that average weekly earnings for non-agricultural workers in $1989, that's adjusting for inflation, was lower in 1990 than it was in 1969. Think about it. The real wages, the buying power of the average worker, non-agricultural worker in this country, and that's everybody, from the CEOs of the biggest companies to the floor sweepers or whatever. The average worker's income was down 12%. Now, most of us, over a 20-year period, most of us don't realize that the take-home, because these things happen very slowly, erosion of buying power happens slowly, but our standard of living went down. Now, we compensated for it, and one of the reasons this came as a surprise to me, and I think it may come as a surprise to many of you, is that we compensated as a country by having more members of the family working. And there's been a great influx into the workforce during this same 20 years of wives and spouses, so that family income has not eroded nearly as much in real terms as individual income. However, the number of spouses or other family members in the workforce is not likely to increase very much over the next 10 or 15 years. We're in the baby dearth, as you in the college business know. There are fewer people coming to college and coming into the workforce over the next 3 to 5 years than they were over the previous 20 or 25 years. And so the workforce is not expanding. And as a result, family incomes cannot keep pace by more people going into the workforce. So this economic cliff, this 12% erosion, which will continue unless we do something about it, is going to have a more severe impact on those families who are already accustomed to two or more people in the family working. The second point is that the productivity, not only the average income is down in real terms, but our rate of productivity growth is severely down. And that's shown in that slide. Meanwhile, the productivity of our international competitors, Germany and Japan and all of Europe, has been growing at 3 to 5% a year. We used to grow at 3%. We're now growing at 1%. And last year, it was less than 1%. So our rate of productivity is slow to a crawl. And when productivity doesn't increase, businesses cannot afford to give wage increases. The way in which our economy went ahead when I was growing up, when in the 30s and 40s and 50s, real wages went up because real productivity went up very dramatically. Productivity in this country has not increased, and it's much less than our industrialized peers and dramatically less than the rate of productivity growth in emerging countries like Taiwan and Korea and Singapore and many others that you could mention. What I think may be happening, to put this in the broader historical context, is that we're in what could be called the third industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution, as most of you know, occurred in England in the 18th century when the steam engine was invented, when water power was harnessed, and people moved from farms to factories. They were relatively crude factories by our standards, but the steam engine and water power and people working all in one place enabled the English to build things like locomotives and large engines and steel furnaces, and that was the first industrial revolution. The second industrial revolution occurred in the United States, basically, based on electricity as an invention and the ability to harness electricity, and it's what we know as the modern production line. Henry Ford was the pioneer of taking people from a craft-oriented factory situation, which is the way it was done in England, to a streamlined industrial production line where people with an 8th grade education could come off the farms, and that's who came to Detroit, people from rural areas without high educational levels. The jobs were divided into very small pieces, and people could learn to do those jobs with very little training. So with an 8th grade education, you can learn to bolt a carburetor onto an engine and do it 50 times a day or 30 times an hour, depending on the complexity of the job. Doesn't take a lot of training. And that means the production was very efficient, provided the production runs were very long and very simple. Henry Ford said, you can have any color car you want as long as it's black. Because to change from black to red to green to purple to whatever interrupted that production line. It slowed it down. It required more logistics, more thinking, and changing. Okay? That method of production, is no longer valid in this economy. People want a high differentiation of products, many variations. Go to your supermarket and if you sit back and look at the numbers of cereals, the numbers of soaps, the numbers of toothpastes, it's mind-boggling. And the same with our cars or our computers or our cameras or the TV sets that Circuit City sells. Go look at that wall and how many differentiations there are by product. Minor ones, but that's what people want. And the market has responded to that. And all this differentiation makes much more complicated production processes. Well, we excelled in the second industrial revolution, but we're now in the third industrial revolution, based on computers, based on technology, based on higher communications, and an 8th grade education, somebody coming off the farm with very low skills and no ability to understand computers and mathematics and basic physics cannot hack it in a modern factory. And unless the United States, the Japanese are experts at the third industrial revolution. The Europeans are getting there. And the United States' position in the world will continue to deteriorate in terms of our balance of payments, our budget deficits, and many of the social problems we have, I believe, unless we as a society begin to address more efficient means of production and get ahead of the curve in the third industrial revolution instead of being behind. England failed to make the transition in many ways from the first to the second industrial revolution. England was a leading power in the world 150 years ago. You all know about Rule Britannia and the sun never sets on the British Empire and that sort of thing. And now, well, it's not a poor country. It's no longer a world leader, and it's no longer the standard to which other countries look up. And many of its people, there's high unemployment, lower living standards relative to the rest of the world than where they were 50 or 100 years ago. That could happen here. It's in the process of happening here, and that first chart I showed you demonstrates that real wages after inflation are 12% less than 20 years ago. And that can continue, it can accelerate, unless we make the kind of changes that we're talking about. So that's the background. Another factor that's significant here is that incomes have widely diverged in this country during the same period that productivity has gone down or stagnated and real income has gone down. There's a much greater gap between the well-paid and the moderately or less well and low-paid. 54%, let's see, this is a distribution of income from 67 to 87, the top 30% of the workforce, and basically 30% of the American public goes to college, 70% does not. The 30%, and this is by and large correlates with college education, used to control 54% of the income, and it's now 58, and the bottom 70% has dropped from 46 to 42. The disparity between professional and managerial on the one hand and high-skilled workers was like 3 or 4% 20 years ago. Today it's in the range of 20%. And so we've got a widening disparity of income, and that exacerbates our problem. We used to have the highest level of income in the world. Today there are 13 nations that pay higher wages to their workers in real terms, adjusted for currency fluctuations, etc. The standards of living for the average worker in 13 countries is now higher than the United States. The relative wages of frontline workers are going down. This is the point I was making earlier. Professional and technical, 72 to 87, the change in wages, they were at 100% of each other. Professional and technical is the standard, I'm sorry. Craft workers used to make 98% of technical and professional, now they make 73%. Clerical workers, I can't read it, 69, and what is the next number, the black? 54. So the point is, there's wider disparity. And the craft, the clerical, the laborers, those peoples are making relatively less than professional and technical as compared to 20 years ago, increasing that disparity. This is the point about the production lines that I made a little earlier. The reason that the production line, the Henry Ford or the Tayloristic model, is no longer efficient in an era of high differentiation of product models and very rapid change of products is that it requires many layers of supervision. And the faster you change and the more different models you produce, the more supervisors or indirect workers are required. Factories now have on average 3 or 4 indirect workers for every direct worker. When production is organized in a production line, you need somebody to maintain the machines. I mean, the worker who's there, who got trained in a half hour to put that nut on that bolt, he doesn't know how to set up the machine. and fix it when it's broken. He doesn't do anything about scheduling the nuts and the bolts that flow to him. Somebody else does that. He doesn't check the quality of his own work. He doesn't do the maintenance on the machines to prevent it from breaking down, on and on. There are more and more levels of indirect workers supporting that person. The ways in which factories are organized abroad, requiring high-skilled workers, not people with 8th grade educations, is they work as a team. And you've all heard about the Japanese team concept, where the workers get together and discuss the problems. How can we make this process more efficient? How can I hand it off from here to there? I saw a Volvo factory in Sweden where they work as teams. Part of the time they were assembling. This particular factory was making seats. Half the day they can be assembling, and then they switch to avoid the boredom, and they become pickers, taking the parts out of the warehouse by forklift and bringing it over. They schedule their own work. Somebody wants to go to school, the team decides, okay, Janie for the next 6 weeks, Janie won't be here from 4 to 7 in the evening, or whatever the time is, from 2 to 5, and we'll fill in for her. We'll find somebody else. They schedule their own work, they schedule their own parts, they assemble it, they do their own quality control. It's much more interesting and it's much more efficient because all those levels of supervision are gone. The workers are self-supervising, self-selecting, self-directing. And as a result, costs are lower because they don't have all these indirect layers. Okay. And this really makes the point I was just making. There's the support to the frontline workers in the new work organization. In the old one, it's the other way around. Now, we do the worst job in the world, in the industrialized world, of preparing our frontline workers. This chart shows algebra results for 17-year-olds. The percentage of the population taking the course is the horizontal scale, and the vertical is the percent that do it properly. In Japan, roughly the same percentage, 10 or 12% take algebra, as in the United States. But look where we rank. We rank down there with Hungary in terms of the results. That's a telling chart. United Kingdom, Finland, Belgium, Sweden, Austria, all do better than we do. And on math, as most of you know, the Koreans are reported to have the best math results of anybody in the world. Not, I believe, because they're any smarter than American kids, but because the way the school system is organized and the school-to-work transition. Okay. Now, the problems with our schools, I'm sure what's here is very similar to things that Joe Spagnella talked about this morning. Tracking and low expectations for the non-college bound. And I heard some of that in one of these seminars that in York County, with the assistance of the Southern Educational Conference, an experiment is going on to eliminate or reduce that tracking and have high expectations for everybody, whether you're going to be a car mechanic or a waitress or a high-tech worker at NASA. Same expectations. This is true in Europe. It's true in Japan. The slower people, kids that don't learn as fast in Japan, the difference is they don't track them, that you have to learn less. They expect them to go to school longer. So a slower learning student in Japan goes on Saturdays. And if he doesn't, and he takes home more homework. And if he doesn't, they already have lots of homework, but he takes home more. And then he goes on Saturdays. And if he doesn't get it in 6 days, he goes over the summer. But by the following fall, every Japanese kid, I mean virtually, 95% or 98%, is ready to go into the next grade. Not because he has a social promotion, but because the society expects it and assists him to master that material so that he is truly prepared. Gifted kids learn faster, but everybody in Japan is expected through the age of 16 to master that basic material. We have, as I don't have to elaborate this, problems with the poor, and I know Joe spoke about preparing our children to enter school, particularly children from underprivileged and low-income families. More than 90%, we have no standards. More than 90% of employers view a high school diploma as having little educational value. Dropping out is permissible in our society. It's not permissible elsewhere. I mean, sure, the Germans have their dropouts and the Swedes have their dropouts, but they have an active outreach program to bring these kids back into the system. Now, they don't bring them back necessarily to the same school they dropped out of and repeat the failure. They have alternative learning environments. They have environments which are informal, which don't have, benches or seats in the classroom and the normal tables and chairs and a blackboard. It may be computerized learning, or it may be learning, what we would call a CCC kind of camp. In other words, they take them into the woods. They might work during the day, take some courses in the afternoon or the evening, but it's an informal environment particularly suited to kids that can't make it in the traditional sit-down, chalkboard and classroom environment. Unequal access to resources for the rich and poor, and we have undoubtedly the worst school-to-work transition of any country in the world. Everybody else, every other society, industrialized society, has an organized way to assist kids to getting from education into the workforce. The Germans probably have the most elaborate, the most complicated, but also one of the best known. It's an apprenticeship program. You've all heard of the German apprenticeship system. It's applicable to virtually every occupation. You could not, in our country, as you know, apprenticeship is primarily limited to the building trades. In Germany, if you're going into the banking business, into the insurance business, into the retail trades, you want to be a hairdresser or a waitress, a hotel worker of any kind, a chef, or a cook or a dining room worker. There's an apprenticeship program. The program is defined by business and labor and the government. In each case, that tripartite, they call it a tripartite system, decides what it is that a cook should know. What is it that a hairdresser or a taxi cab driver or an industrial technician or a bank clerk needs to know, or a retail clerk? That is described, and from the age of 16 to either 18 or 20, every German youth spends 3 or 4 days a week in a working environment, in a day or two, sometimes 3 days a week, in a classroom environment, but the classroom training, as in our community colleges, is directly oriented to what the child is learning or doing, so that obviously the mathematics that somebody going in the banking business needs to know is different than the mathematics that somebody's going to be a carpenter. One would emphasize arithmetic and statistics and algebra, and the other geometry, so that the math or the English, or in that case the German, the language, is focused on and is related to what the student's going to learn. Now, other countries have somewhat different systems, but all of them have far better programs than we do of linking school to work, so that what the kid learns he sees is relevant to what he's going to do or what he is doing in this working experience. And obviously a motivating factor. We don't do any of that. Okay. Now, briefly, our recommendations. The first recommendation is to establish the certificate of initial mastery, a high performance standard to be met by age 18, and that recommendation was seconded by the Virginia Commission, which Bob referred, and I'm sure Joe Spagnola spoke about. It will be benchmarked, not to Illinois, not to North Carolina, not to West Virginia. It'll be benchmarked to Germany, Sweden, and Japan. That's who we have to compete with. And until we recognize that and focus on that, that first chart is going to continue to happen. Our standards of living will go down. Because the President has called for a national assessment system, and one of the important points here is this assessment system would not be a typical paper and pencil test. and it wouldn't be done as in Japan over a day or two and the testing hell. The recommendation is we do it in an American fashion over a period of years, more like the merit badge of the Scout system, so that you would demonstrate your proficiency at various ages, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, etc., in various subjects: history, geography, math, science, English. And you would do it with portfolios. You'd have an examination. You might have to stand up, and as Ted Sizers recommends, and is demonstrated in many places, that the kid can best show what he knows by standing up in the classroom and telling other children what he knows, not by sitting at a desk privately filling in machine scorable tests. So it's a test that could be oriented in every state and every locality to be equal and fair to minorities and ethnic minorities of all kinds, so that it would eliminate the kind of bias that exists in existing testing systems. Second recommendation is that for those who don't make it, that we have a dropout recovery system, a youth center, somewhat like I talked about that they have in Sweden. That kids who don't make it in school, whether it's for academic reasons, personal reasons, family reasons, health reasons, whatever, would have an alternative learning environment. Now, we recommend a stick as well as a carrot here. One of, I think, the problems of American education is that there really is not much incentive for a 16-year-old to stay in school. He can drop out, go work at McDonald's, make his $4 an hour, buy a car, impress his girlfriend or her boyfriend, buy fancy sneakers and jewelry and all that other stuff. And all of that's more important to kids because they don't see the relevance of staying in school and mastering algebra or English or whatever. And we allow it, we encourage it. What we're recommending is if you're not in school, and West Virginia said if you're not in school, you can't get a driver's license. We're recommending for Virginia, and the Virginia Commission recommends this, and for the country, that if you're 16 and drop out of school, you cannot work until you're age 18. You cannot get an exemption to child labor laws unless you're enrolled in one of these youth centers. Now, you could work at McDonald's provided, and we haven't specified the number of hours, but 10 or 15 hours a week. In the evenings, Saturdays, whatever, you come to the youth center. And there, this youth center would deal with some of your emotional problems or your family problems, your personal problems, but would also require you to continue working for your certificate of mastery. So there would be an important informal educational component that while you were working, you would still be pursuing this certificate. And we think that's a critical factor, motivating factor. Okay, moving quickly, we should create 2 to 4-year professional technical training programs with industry-defined standards. And a lot of that is happening, right here at Thomas Nelson. Apprenticeship certificates or training, or certifications, technical certifications, certifying as they do in Germany, that you're a certified plumber or bank clerk or electrician or whatever. It dignifies the work that non-college bound kids perform, gives them status, and it gives the employers a validation that the kids have mastered the material that the employers have had a major say in defining as necessary for that particular skill or occupation. Fourth recommendation, employers should be encouraged to invest in education and training of their existing workers. 92% of the workers in the year 2000 are already on the job. And if this country is going to pull itself up by its boots, in the year 2000, we can not only focus on those that are entering the workforce, but by far the overwhelming number of those in the workforce in the year 2000 are there today. And we called for a tax, basically, that every employer would have to invest 1 or 1.5% of payroll on training all of his workers, not just the professionals and the data processing people and the managers, and because American business does a pretty good job of that, but also invest in training and upgrading the skills of the frontline workers in proportion to their prevalence in the workforce, and that 1.5% needs to be spent on that. If you spend it, you deduct it from your tax return. If you don't spend it, you pay the tax in full, and that goes into a fund which would be used to finance on-the-job training for those employers who, for whatever reason, and it may be some legitimate reasons, a dry cleaner with 3 or 4 employees may not be able to run a training program, but yet his workers, their skills need to be upgraded too, both for their existing jobs and for future jobs. Okay. The recommendations ends up in a chart which shows, and we have a very similar chart in the Virginia report that basically shows that kids move from elementary school, get to through secondary school or technical options, to college or into the workforce, that basically at the age of 16, a kid has 3 options. He can go to work if he's got a certificate of initial mastery. He can get a technical certificate at a junior college or community college, or he can continue college preparation and go to college. And we believe the system needs to be very flexible, because not everybody at 16 is ready to make a lifetime commitment. And so those who picked the college route could drop back if they choose and pursue a technical degree. And by the same token, those who pursued a technical degree could switch and use the credits that they've accumulated in that 2 or 4 year interval after 16, to the extent they're relevant and useful, they would be applicable to college, and they would get college credit towards a baccalaureate degree. And by the same token, the system would always be open for the workers who dropped out of an educational system after 16 and went into the workforce. They could come back while they were working or at some other time in their career. They'd be 50 years old and get, like a GED, get that certificate of initial mastery that would put them back on the track to pursue a technical professional degree or a college education. That, in a nutshell, is the proposal. The bottom line is in the title of the report: America's Choice, High Skills or Low Wages. Economics, in a competitive world with low tariff barriers, there is no choice. Okay? American business and other businesses are going to go for the greatest productivity. They are to wherever that workforce is that's going to give them the greatest productivity. There are 2 types of productivity. There's the real cheap, low-wage productivity. Okay, it may not be efficient, but if you're paying 50 cents an hour or 30 cents an hour, as you will in Bangladesh, or 75 cents as in Mexico, businesses that only want the lowest possible cost, whether they're American businesses or foreign businesses, are going to put their plants where those 75-cent workers are. The other choice are jobs that pay $5 and $10 and $20 an hour, and those jobs go only to societies that have highly skilled workers. Obviously, we don't want to compete with the underdeveloped countries in the world to see who can pay the lowest possible wages. We want to compete with Japan and Germany, and France and Sweden, where they're paying high wages to high-skilled workers. That's what's going to reverse that curve, that chart that I first showed you, so that real incomes after inflation can, in this country, real standards of living can start up again and stop declining. The choice is ours, and I'm delighted that Thomas Nelson, Bob Templin, and all of you in the peninsula here are taking the initiative, and you've taken a lot of initiatives, leading, I believe, this state towards worker development, worker and job reorganization in a way that we can reclaim the high ground for productivity, high skills, and high wages. Thank you. I don't want to trespass on your time, but to the extent that we have a few minutes, and Bob, you tell me when that few minutes is up and you need to resume your regular agenda, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions or comments or whatever that you may have. I'd like to step down just a minute to get a glass of water. The question is, how do labor unions feel about this? I think that's a good question, and it's a serious concern. At one level, I can tell you that the report of the National Commission contained representatives from the AFL, from AFSCME, the American Federation of State and Municipal Employees, from the CIO, and the report was unanimous. The Virginia Commission had a representative of the Virginia AFL-CIO, and he endorsed it. But that's, at one level, there's support. The question is, on the firing line, on the plant floor, what will the reaction of labor unions be? I believe, properly explained, everybody sees it in their interest to increase wages and productivity. Bob was telling me earlier that at the Siemens plant here, that Siemens has reorganized the work with essentially the same workforce that Bendix had, and that the unions are now highly supportive. They were suspicious, but as I understand it, Siemens is paying people based on how much they know, and there's no limit. The more you know, the more productive you can become, and therefore the more you can make. And the unions are now supporting. Is that correct? So I think it has to be properly explained. Change is threatening. Change is threatening to all of us, whether it's in business or education or in labor movement. But if it's, what we're talking about is expanding the pie. We have been fighting, in a sense, politically, the haves and the have-nots in this country, and that's basically what political fights are about, is the allocation of society's resources, have been fighting over a shrinking pie. We now need to turn that around and expand the pie. And the only way to expand the pie is to increase productivity in our businesses, in our jobs. And if there's more productivity, then business can afford higher wages. And I think unions understand that. Any other questions?
What do you see the future of a high school diploma?
What is the future of a high school diploma? That's a tough question, and I think we, as you know, we wrestled with that with the commission. The key, as far as I'm concerned, is age 16. He's demonstrating at that age that as a student, you are proficient at world standards in English and math, geography and history, and science. To me, beyond that, a high school diploma is not terribly relevant, except as a social recognition. And I would continue that, I believe, because I think to do away with it would be politically difficult at best, and maybe politically impossible. But I would continue it and make it available to everybody, whichever one of those three options they chose. If they want to go to work, fine. They can stay aligned with their high school, possibly play on the high school football team, basketball team, until they're 18, and graduate not with a high school diploma, but with their class and with some recognition. Clearly, though, those that are pursuing a technical degree or college-bound would continue in their affiliated with their high school, even if they went to a community college or some other place to get that formal education, and could receive, if they qualified, a high school degree, and enable them to continue to participate in the social, athletic, and non-academic aspects of being a high school student, regardless of whether their courses were physically at the high school or someplace else. But that's a controversial subject, and some of you may have very different views on how that should be done. The substance is more important to me than the form. Senator.
Can you go into what is involved in the certificate of measure, what kind of skills you're looking at?
Well, We're basing it on, it's the key subject matters. I think one of the problems with American high school education, or elementary and high school education, is it spreads itself too thin. Our European counterparts don't do that. It's competency in math, in science, in English, some geography and some history, benchmarked to world-class standards. Now, the other things that prepare people to work productively in the workforce, and there are other skills, I think can be learned from between 16 and 18 in these kind of apprenticeship-oriented or mentorship programs. The social skills of working together, the problem solving as a team, the being work ready, in other words, knowing that you have to show up on time and properly dressed and with the right attitude. Some of that can be done prior to 16, but I think that acculturation to the workplace is probably best done in the interaction with the workplace rather than taught as an academic matter to kids under the age of 16. But again, that's a personal view, and many of you know more about that than I do, and I don't think that's critical to the argument that we're making here. Kids need to know both the substance and the work readiness skills. How they learn it is something that others in this room are much better qualified to answer than I. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, you've heard a number of stirring remarks today from both an educator's perspective and from a business person's perspective. Lest you go away feeling that all of this is a bit overwhelming, I'd like to bring this back to perspective. And that is, while you've seen a national agenda that's being shaped by the Commission report, being reflected in President Bush's report, a nation heading in a direction, so too you see the Commonwealth of Virginia with a clear vision with regard to pathways that are available to us. But let's not forget that many of the seeds from which these ideas sprang were planted right here. Many of the activities that you're engaged in, whether it be in terms of the new concepts of applied math and science, or what it means that early intervention in working with preschoolers, many of those ideas are being experimented with right now in our own schools. The peninsula, believe me, because I've been out across the state over the past 18 months, the peninsula and the work that you're doing is leading the way in Virginia and the nation, and that the efforts that we're making here today, while somewhat cumbersome and sometimes clumsy, will be the models for Virginia and the nation tomorrow. You ought to be proud of the effort that you're in. You are leaders. You are true pioneers. And it's because of your efforts that I'm so excited and hopeful about our future. Mr. Wurzel, if you'd come forward, I'd like to present you with a small token of our appreciation. On behalf of the conference and all those that are here, thank you for being with us today, Alan.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
I hope that you believe that each year these conferences and the themes that we pick become more and more relevant to the work that you're about and to our cooperative effort of creating a single unified education system where the primary beneficiary are our children and our young people and our young adults. Together, our future is very bright indeed. Thank you for being with us. Rex, do you want to bring some closing remarks?
I'll be very brief. We thank you very much for coming to the Articulation Conference today. In your packet of information, there is an evaluation form. We would appreciate you taking just a couple of minutes to fill that out and drop it off at the registration table as you exit today. Let me take time to thank those individuals who agreed to be presenters today and also our industry partners who came and set up displays and talked with each of you about the Adams Project. If those presenters and industry partners will please stand, I'd like for us to give them a round of applause. I realize that in setting up a conference, it really is not possible without the work and cooperation of a lot of people. So I'd like to ask the Thomas Nelson support staff that helped behind the scenes put the conference together today to please stand and be recognized. As you can tell, they're a very modest group. Again, I thank you for coming to the Articulation Conference today. I hope that you will look forward to next year's conference, and I also hope that you will take home some of these ideas and share them with your colleagues and friends and expand on some of the ideas that were discussed today. Thank you for coming.